Thank you, Greg. We're now going to move into the final part of the evening. Come on, panelists, come on up. Where's Luke Sheahan? Is he there at the corner? Luke Sheahan is not just the editor of the University of, but he's a professor, a young professor at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, and also a widely published author in his own rights. And we have Susan Goldberg joining us on stage. She was mentioned by Governor Engler. Susan is a distinguished member of our jury. She's president and CEO of WGBH, which is the public media company in Boston that is the largest producer of multi-platform content for PBS and NPR. And before that, she was a prize-winning editor of National Geographic for more than 8 years. And I believe you were the first woman editor of the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Is that I'm not okay? That's impressive. But just to be the editor of the Cleveland Plain Dealer is amazing. She's a six-time juror for the Pulitzer Prize. So our ambitions for the Pulitzer Prize are, not ill-founded. We have experience alongside us. So now we'll move to our panel. Dr. Luke Sheahan, you are the host, and carry us forward. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for everyone, again, for being here, and for the panelists. So I'd like just to take us through a colloquial discussion on the threats and promises of the present age. So we could start off with the threats to free speech. Some of these are perennial, of course, human nature being what it is. But are there any that are peculiar to our age?
I would say one of the things I'm the most worried about is that for all of my life, frankly, there was a libertarian ethos that had at least some purchase on both sides of the political fence. There was a sort of more libertarian right, and there was an aspect of the libertarian left, which is what I come from, which is, people like Nadine Strawson, who I mentioned several times, come from that. And what I'm scared about now is that without that aspect, I feel like America to some degree just becomes like every other country in the world. And I mean that in the worst possible way. And right now it is harder as an organization like FIRE to find principled advocates on either side of the political fence. A lot of us we're finding increasingly our most fervent advocates, the most reliable people, are people who feel completely orphaned in the culture war. But I do think it's hard to maintain freedom of speech if it's ever perceived as a unipolar value, but particularly when it's not valued necessarily on either side. So that's probably the thing that worries me the most on the highest level.
I've been thinking a lot about the New York Times versus Sullivan, which is a famous Supreme Court case from 1964 that established the right to make a mistake and not get sued out of existence if the people you're writing about are powerful public figures, particularly elected officials. And there's been a lot of talk recently about whether this incredibly important decision that protects not just the press, but I would say the right of everyone to question and criticize and to hold people up, famous people, rich people, up to scrutiny. If that gets degraded, if that somehow goes away, then I think we've got a very difficult free speech problem in the country. And as I say, that inhibits freedom of expression for everybody, not just the press.
So Greg talked in his remarks about the promise of social media and the internet, and I think that's right. There are great advantages. But I worry about the consequences of a society in which everything that any of us says is on the permanent record, is potentially on the permanent record and available to everyone. One of the bulwarks of free speech, not so much as a philosophical principle or a legal right, but as a practice, I think, is the expectation of forgetting. That you can say things that you might say differently under other circumstances or might not say at all, but they'll be limited to your immediate audience and will be forgotten in a day or a week or a month. That's important to free speech for those who are not public figures who are uttering official statements. And I worry, particularly in observing students, that they fear, and quite rightly fear, that they are under oath at all times, and the smallest mistake of judgment or phrasing could lead to their lives being ruined. And again, they're not crazy to worry about that. So again, there are advantages to social media and moving at the speed of thought, and sometimes faster than the speed of thought. But there are risks too, and I wonder if some of the instinctive hostility or reluctance about free speech that Greg describes, especially among younger people, has to do with justified fear of speaking onto the record at all times and in all settings.
What do you think can be done to counter these threats? Or what are some actions we could take now to preempt them in some way, counter them? This is a very broad question, and I mean it in the absolute broadest sense. The founding of institutions, the passing of legislation.
I mean, the simplest problem to address is defending New York Times v. Sullivan, and all of us should do that. I think people really underestimate how much we rely, every American relies actually on that decision, and I think the alternative history that we'll create if it's gone is not one that people really underestimate how bad it would actually be if that went away. And we were seeing moments of sort of bipartisan agreement that New York Times v. Sullivan was bad, and which I think is just completely insane. So I think the coming together to defend New York Times v. Sullivan is the easiest one.
Well, I do think there's a real threat around that, as I mentioned, but I think we need to do a much better job of educating people about the First Amendment. I mean, most people can't name the 5 freedoms. If you ask people in a poll about freedom of speech or freedom of the press, a lot of people go, "Oh, that's a bad idea." And I don't think people really understand how much the best parts of our society have flourished because of that. And we in the media, and I've spent my entire life as a journalist, have done a really rotten job of educating people and helping people understand, and we really need to do a better job about that.
Well, we educators haven't done any better a job, so don't apologize for journalists.
Oh, I did want to. It wasn't expecting to be quite that fast. We are doing quite a bit of work educating young people about free speech. We're just telling them the worst possible lessons in the world about it. And I talk about this. This used to be the way I would open up my talks when I would talk to high school students. Is that, guys, you're being taught the 3 Bs. You're being taught that free speech is the argument of the bully, and I have Nelson from The Simpsons, the bigot, and I have Cartman from South Park, and the robber baron, and I have Kingpin from Marvel. And you're being taught that these are the 3 people who benefit from freedom of speech, and that's a lie. Because rich people, powerful people do just fine because they're rich and powerful. And the bully and the bigot get to decide what's what in a democracy if they have the vote. You literally only need a special protection for freedom of speech for minority points of view and those unpopular with people in power. They have never heard this before. Now, what's crazy, though, is I now have to give this when I give law school talks, because they've been so miseducated. They really do think that free speech is historically the argument of the bad guy. So not only do we have to actually do a better job of teaching about it, we have to actually teach correct lessons about it, because we are teaching a ton about it. It's just all bad.
What sort of positive movements do you see? Founding of institutions comes to mind as there's a founding of kind of a new Lyceum movement. So people will be having, like the old Lyceum debates of the 19th century, and reviving those, so people are seeing productive civil conversations and debates along the same lines, but on a widespread basis again. That's just an example, but what sort of things might be positive movements? I think we've all seen the negative movements. I was quite surprised when I give my free speech hypothetical in my con law class, and I just took it for granted. I thought the students would all kind of obviously take the side of free speech, and very few of them do, for the reasons you just laid out. And it surprised me quite a bit how much I'd have to just correct their basic case law we had just read to get them on the right track. But what what might be positive that we're saying?
I think a lot of people, for different reasons, are pissed off at the overwhelming suppression of speech, especially related to COVID. And we heard a little bit about that earlier this evening. The effects, as is often the case with movements to suppress ideas, I think that was probably counterproductive in the long run. And there seems to be an immune reaction sort of built into the polity that has raised the salience of these issues, and I think made more people more sympathetic to arguments about free speech than they were even just a few years ago. It's not dominant yet, but I do think, and I'd be interested to hear if Greg has observed anything similar, that there is some reversal of the pendulum on this.
Yeah, I definitely have two different opinions on this. One is after doing this for now 23 years, putting all the data together with Ricky Schlott for canceling the American mind, it left me incredibly depressed because there is no period in American history that you can point to, and I'm including McCarthyism here, where more professors have been fired for their speech. I mean, 1 in 6 professors say they've either been punished for their speech or actually punished. That's like 100,000 professors. There is no historical comparison for this. So things got really bad. Now, when I was promoting the book, I ended up being on Bill Maher's show, and he said something pretty funny, which was that, you know, as bad as October 7th was, one positive thing that came out of it was that nobody thinks there's nothing wrong on campuses anymore. And that's true. But I'm hearing this sense that from some people, it's like, oh, well, you know, political correctness, that was crazy. And that was like 85 to 95. And we got over that. And the pendulum swung back. And I always have to point out, that's actually bad history. Everything got way worse after 95. Just the media stopped paying attention to it. So I think we are badly underestimating how big the reform needs to be, about how much we have damaged the institutions that help us understand what the world actually looks like. And I mean, I'm going to be very grave about this issue. I have not seen a single hot button issue in the United States where I don't know of students or professors who have not been punished, if not, or for professors, you know, fired or suspended for being on the wrong side of that. When you add that to every other conformity-inducing pressure, there is every reason in the world why when Americans are asked to trust our expert class, they shouldn't on any issue that has any political valence whatsoever. And these days, most issues have political valence. So I know I was supposed to say something positive, but what I'm saying is, like, we really have to think hard on ways, on bigger reforms that are even currently on the table.
I know this was supposed to be positive, but I was about to say the same thing. But you know, I think a lot about the job of the press in a time like this, and I'm really proud of the institutions that I've worked for, and I'm aware that, you know, there are media organizations that do a great job, and there's media organizations that do a terrible job. I think I've mostly worked for media organizations that do a great job and that work incredibly hard to try to get it right. But man, we are making it harder every day to be a legitimate seeker of the truth and of facts. And I am very worried about what could happen to the Freedom of Information Act. Could it be even harder for people to get information? I'm incredibly worried about the demonization of the press that has occurred, this whole enemy of the people refrain. I'm incredibly worried about the violence that people in the press face in just going about doing their jobs. And I'm incredibly worried about the threats of retribution, imprisonment, investigation, about people trying to exercise their rights as legitimate members of the press to help make the public more informed. And people can either agree or disagree with how those stories are, but man, we got to have people reporting and doing that work to live in the country that I think we all want to live in. I know, that was supposed to be happy.
So I think they misunderstood the assignment. So I think I largely agree. We know that there's declining trust in our institutions.
Oh, wait. Something positive did occur to me. You, one thing, University of Austin, the fact that people really are trying to start new institutions from scratch, I think is absolutely phenomenal. And I talk a lot about sort of micro credentialing. Basically, like, it's funny because like in a book where we talk so much about reforming, people think we're going to end by talking about like little band-aid solutions for reforming higher ed, and I'm like, the very first thing that needs to happen is way fewer jobs should require a BA in the first place.
Any other positive things that we might think about? We've got some, the new institutions are really exciting, and they seem to be doing, from Twitter, extremely well. And I think for reasons that are fairly obvious, they're doing what the other institutions have ceased to do. Is there anything else that would leave us on a good note before we start watching some football?
I would say one other thing. I think we're really underestimating young people, that we're not, everybody's does, I think, this with every generation. They're not paying any attention. Oh my gosh, their attention spans are so short. They're just not getting it. They don't care. I would say that the young people that I deal with and that we try to seek out for stories, they really care and they're really engaged. I don't really understand exactly how it's going to work to get news stories on Twitter, but there was a time, excuse me, I meant on TikTok, but there was a time when people didn't understand how that would work on the radio or on television or on every time there's a technology change, the older people are always wringing their hands and, getting upset. So I would just say that the young people who we go seek out their views, they really care. They want to live in a great country. They want to be engaged citizens. They want to know what's going on. And so I would say that's actually a positive, and we should give them the benefit of the doubt.
Now, this is a question maybe I should have opened with. It's more philosophical, I guess. Free speech is famously defended by John Stuart Mill in the 19th century. And that essay has gotten criticism. I had a professor in college who was a huge fan of the conclusions that John Stuart Mill comes to, but he had this great line that said, John Stuart Mill is proof that you don't have to be a great philosopher to be a great liberal philosopher.
Oh my God. I'm so sorry. Every critic of John Stuart Mill is not as intelligent as John Stuart Mill. Anytime anyone brings this up, I'm kind of like, John Stuart Mill spoke Greek at 3.
That's true.
No offense to your professor, but a little bit of offense to your professor.
What might be some in the scholarship? Is there anything that ought to get more attention? I've written on conservative defenses, drawing from Michael Oakeshott, Russell Kirk, Robert Nisbet, names familiar, I think, in this room, and using kind of their presuppositions and philosophical arguments to defend broad and strong protections for free speech. But are there ways in which the bolstering of the free speech and free press can come from different quarters than we're accustomed to?
Well, since those are some of the figures I'm writing about in my book, I don't have a good answer. I'm not. It's the same corners that you're describing, but one area of interest for me that's worth exploring are some of the traditional religious defenses of free speech and conscience that have largely been forgotten, and that are important also for, I think, counteracting the impression that Greg describes, that free speech is sort of a weapon of the powerful to enforce their will. That hasn't been true historically, and it's often been members of dissenting religious minorities that have developed very, very powerful defenses of free speech on religious terms. not from the kind of secular liberalism that Mill represents so well.
I mean, my favorite philosophers are always people who think in terms of structures that work. So I'm a big fan of Karl Popper. I'm obviously a big fan of Mill. Big fan of James Madison, who I think is an amazing, philosopher in his own right. But also John Locke. And a lot of my favorite writing at the moment, that's in the scholarship, is coming from ways to improve. Because we need big solutions that exist entirely outside of the academy. It is one of my big takeaways here. But there are things that you can do within the academy that could actually improve things quite a bit. And some of the ideas include things like adversarial collaboration, like the idea of making it more the norm than not, that essentially scholarship should be two scholars who actually disagree with each other working together on a way to prove who was right or wrong. Actually harness the power of adversarial relationships like we have in law to actually get closer to the truth. Because, basically it's because there's so little viewpoint diversity in higher ed, you have to kind of you have to actually seek it out on purpose. But it can actually potentially be a wonderful tool for advancing knowledge. And I think we have to think in terms of structures. Peer review is completely broken. Institutional review boards are gone. But there are deep thinkers out there and philosophers and sociologists and psychologists who are thinking about ways to actually create systems that work better. And every single one of them, just like every First Amendment lawyer, are engaging in rock solid or oftentimes rock solid epistemology.
Well, I'm not a member of the Academy, and I'm not a First Amendment scholar, but I am a practitioner. And so when I really think about this, I am excited that we're starting to have in journalism a conversation again about objective truth. For a while, this kind of became a dirty word, especially I think among younger journalists who said there could actually be no objective truth. But there is actually objective truth, and you can strive like crazy to find it in your stories every single day. And it doesn't mean false equivalence. It means going where the facts lead you. It means starting out with an open mind when of a spirit of true inquiry. It doesn't mean, just finding the facts that you wanted to find because you had already decided what your story was before you left the office. So I really think that there's been a lot of discussion, again in journalism, about getting back to this as just rock solid bedrock principles of how we need to do our jobs. And I don't know if this is going to change how people feel about the press. If you look at polls, people don't believe in institutions anymore, a lot of them, including in the press. But I just think that one story at a time, one organization at a time, we've got to try to rebuild that and work from a common set of shared facts about what's going on. People can draw different conclusions with that information, but how do we get back to some level of agreement that this rug is gray?
This may be one of the areas, too, where there's an educational task, because I think that a lot of the criticisms of objectivity that you describe come from a misunderstanding of what it means, which is not perfection or not making mistakes or not having any bias whatsoever, but rather being transparent about sources and methods, making sure that information is accessible so people can go and try to see the thing you saw, and to use methods that would lead to a reproducible conclusion. If you look at the same evidence in the same way, you will get to the same answer. That's what objectivity means in scholarship, and I think also in journalism. It doesn't mean the sort of view from nowhere that is then rejected. And explaining that is an educational task, and it's one that we have not been particularly good at undertaking.
Can I just say one other thing? I'm so glad you mentioned the transparency aspect of this, because that might be a way that we can do things differently. When I was coming up in journalism, and I'm going to be 65 in a couple of days from now, and so I've been doing this a really long time, but when I was coming up in journalism, you didn't want people to understand how you did things. It was supposed to be like this magical thing that just was, ta-da, here's our great story. Now I think we correctly have come to a place that's completely different. It's like Yes, look at the interviews. Look, on our Frontline show, we produce Frontline for PBS. And on Frontline, you can go back, and if you have the time or interest, you can look at all of the interviews that ended up making their way into an edited show. But you can see that original source material. And more, I think, all kinds of news organizations are trying to create that transparency about who were the sources, who were the people reporting it, how did they go about doing their work, and I hope that that too can help rebuild that trust.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks to the panel. That was a really interesting. I just want to say, in case any of you have some of the concerns that Sam Goldman did, that we didn't have a good housekeeping big cardboard check, $50,000 to give. We did arrange as soon as Greg touched that master craftsman who produced etched glass, $50,000 magically transferred to your account. Just the touching of the glass. So that's how it happened. It did happen.
All Bitcoin.
And actually, if you're interested, it's very a lot of thought went into the creation of the first McLellan board. We have an architect and a painter and a master glass etchman all in the Washington, D.C. area that produced it for us. So there's a little description on it in your program. So, if you take a look at that, and maybe if you'd like to look at it either here or in the reception room afterwards, it'll be there for your viewing. But I want to thank you all for braving the elements and coming out tonight and participating in this inaugural McLellan Prize program. I, of course, want to thank our staff, especially Emily Corwin, who worked so tirelessly with me over the last year on this program. Chris Marling, who's been around, our communications manager. Cecilia Kirk Nelson for her operations and publication support. My academic program officer working, spent a lot on micro-credentials, by the way. Daryl Falkenberg has been around and helped a lot. And Kathleen Mulder for a great planning assist. So thank you all, the hard work leading our staff. I also want to thank the Board of Trustees, the Russell Kirk Center, chaired by T. Kenneth Cripp Jr., who's with us here tonight from Spartanburg. Many of you know Ken and his distinguished alum of the Reagan administration. He's been doing yeoman's work these days with Federalist Society to help with their transition. Ken's a trustee and a counselor, a long-time collaborator with Federalist Society. Governor Engler, of course, our vice chair, is the visionary behind this prize program. Kevin Shields, who I hope some of you meet as our treasurer, and indispensable treasurer and managing director. Dr. Benjamin Lockhart, who many of you know from his time at Grand Valley State University here. Father David Corey, Michael Maybach, Roger Kimball, and Justice Stephen Markman are all with us. We've got a board meeting tomorrow, and hopefully I'll be with you next year. But I won't know for sure until after the meeting. Thanks for the Board of Trustees for all their leadership guidance. And finally, many thanks to the terrific group of volunteers, many of them students here tonight. We missed out on a big group from Hope College and the Markets and Morality program that we collaborate a lot with there because of the snowstorm. They're getting maybe 8 inches or so tonight, so we pray for them. We also have a special intention for a supporter and a friend who had a heart attack last night and wasn't able to be with us here. So just an intention in my prayers, and I hope you'll join me with that tonight for her. Students from Calvin University were here, though. Some Ford fellows from the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. We have volunteers from the 616 service group, which has been great working with Nate Gillespie and Sam Jacobs on that. And also a shout out to the Aquinas guys, Andrew and Christopher Curry, who stepped in and filled the gap for all those Holland kids to do show. So thank you to the volunteers tonight to help out so much. And also to the patient and very talented team at the Amway Grand here who worked with us all together. I now invite you. We'll be adjourned until the second annual McLellan Prize program. And now invite you to join us for a dessert reception. There was mention of a football game, so we'll just leave it with Viva free speech and go Lions. See you next week.